In order for us to become breeders, we needed a female. Yes, there's room for both good breeders and rescue to exist and even work together.
If you're passionate about Basset Hounds, this podcast is for you.
This is WOEBGON, the Basset Hound podcast. I'm your host, Don Bullock. Welcome to WOEBGON, the Basset Hound podcast. I'm Don Bullock. My wife Pam and I have owned Bassets since 1977 and have been showing them in AKC conformation shows since 1990. We've bred and shown numerous AKC champions, and after AKC introduced the Grand Champion title, we had one of the very first Basset Hound AKC Grand Champions. In this episode, I'd like to share how we acquired our first bitch for our breeding program. As I've stated before in previous episodes, a breeder is the owner of a female that's been bred, not the owner of a male. In order for us to become breeders, we needed a female. Now, I know immediately some of you are already thinking people should rescue dogs and not breed them. If we all did that, there would be no dogs, especially good examples of the various breeds. I saw something on Facebook today that sort of says it for me. Adopt, don't shop essentially is saying clean up after bad breeders instead of supporting good ones. Don't get me wrong, as I've stated numerous times in this podcast, Pam and I fully support rescue efforts and contribute to our local Basset Hound group, Daphne Land Basset Rescue, which is a small ranch out in Acton, California, where Dawn Smith and her crew of volunteers attend to the health needs and the nutrition needs to rehabilitate these dogs and get them ready to be adopted. One reason we support Daphne Land Basset Rescue is we know the dogs eventually get adopted. So Pam and I have supported Daphne Land for many years. Yes, there's room for both good breeders and rescue to exist and even work together. I'll say more about that later in this episode. Please remember, if you're listening to the audio version of this podcast, that photos included in the YouTube version are on our show notes page in our website, WOEBGONBassets.com. One of the people other than Andy and Sue Shoemaker who had impressed us with her breeding success was Heather Simonek. She was rather young but had had some great success with her breeding program. Heather's boy, Peanut, was winning a lot, even against stiff competition. One day after a Burbank Kennel Club show, I caught up with Heather and told her I was interested in getting a dog from her, perhaps a girl. Her response was, "I thought you'd never ask." Evidently, Heather had been watching our progress at the shows and thought she'd like to work with us. In future episodes, I'll say much more about Heather, but for now, we'll concentrate on the dogs. A few months after talking to Heather, we were again out at the Palm Springs area dog shows. Many of the Basset Hounds exhibitors who attended these shows spent the whole weekend out in that area. Groups of us would go out to dinner on Friday and Saturday nights. That year, Heather invited Pam and I to go to dinner with a group of her friends. One of the reasons Heather invited us was to tell us she was planning a litter. She was planning a litter and she wanted us to have first choice of the girls. Now, as I pointed out before, that's no guarantee that we'd get a puppy. A lot of things happen between planning a litter and having puppies. Eventually, Heather did have a litter. At the time, Pam and I were very busy at work and other things, and Heather's place was at least 2 hours away. So we were unable to go down and look at the puppies. When the puppies were old enough to travel, Heather brought the two girls up closer to us at a Basset Hound Club of Southern California match. They were too young to compete in the match, so Heather set them up in an exercise pen that was away from all the other dogs. This turned out to be perfect. Not only did we get a chance to see the puppies, so did many of the others at the match. Of course, that included several other breeders. So we were able to get all of their evaluations of the puppies in addition to Heather's. One in particular, Judy Mack, pointed out that one of the girls might have a serious fault. Both the girls looked good to us, but they were very different. This is somewhat common when breeders do an outcross of their line of dogs. One of the girls was substantially bigger than the other girl in just about every way. Knowing us and what we liked, Heather thought we'd like her. Unfortunately, that's the girl that Judy mentioned might have a major fault. The other girl was fairly small and a little lighter in bone. She just wasn't our type of Basset Hound. At least we didn't think so at the time. Since we'd planned to breed our first girl to Moose and start our line of Basset Hounds, this girl just didn't seem like she fit into our plans. I didn't say anything to Heather that day because Pam and I wanted to talk things over before we did. Later that week or the next, I wrote Heather a letter. Now, you have to remember, this was before the internet and email. In the letter, I explained our decision not to take either girl. The next time we saw Heather at a show, she said she understood, but also gave us a chance to change our minds and get the smaller girl. Heather liked her and thought she'd make a great show dog. A few months later, Heather brought the smaller girl to a dog show where we could see her. The girl had grown up quite a bit, and Heather was able to show us her movement. We were able to see the qualities of this girl, and we agreed that she'd make a fine show dog. Since some other breeders were there, we got their input as well. Our question still remained. Was she the right girl to start a line of Basset Hounds using Moose as our foundation stud? We thanked Heather for bringing her to the show, but Pam and I again waited until we got home to discuss her and make our decision. While this girl was rather small and a little light in bone, she certainly had a lot of the qualities that we liked. First off, she was very well structured with a lot of features, especially her front, that were hard to get into Basset Hounds. She also had a very level top line as mentioned in the standard. Her rear angulation was better than Moose's too, something we definitely wanted to improve upon. Those features working together meant she moved well, which was part of why I talked to Heather about getting a puppy in the first place. We talked about the puppy's lightness and bone, which wasn't as all severe as we had thought, and it seemed to be less of a problem for us. Besides, we'd planned to breed her to Moose, who had an abundance of bone. What was even better, in my opinion, was her temperament. This girl had a lot of spunk and energy. These were things our shoe-flies Bassets lacked. That spunk was one of the things that caused us to call Heather and tell her that we decided to change our minds and wanted the girl. Heather was delighted, and as soon as we could arrange to drive down to her home, we did. Heather and her mother escorted us into Heather's dining room, where we signed the contract and paid for the girl. We handed Heather's mother a check. She was the one who funded the litter. Suddenly, we were headed home with a new girl, and as before, we placed her in the exercise pen. Now for a name. We decided that for girls, we didn't want to use beer names like we had for the boys. Besides, this girl had no connection to Shoefly. As Pam and I discussed some options, the idea of soft drink names came up. Sort of the opposite of beers, but still drinks. Now here's where naming the new girl took an interesting twist. One of Pam's favorite singers and entertainers at the time was Barry Manilow. One of the songs that he sang that Pam liked was Mandy. Pam thought that might be a great name for the new girl. Now we had to come up with some kind of connection with Mandy and a soft drink. Since the girl was so spunky, I came up with Mountain Dew, a caffeinated soft drink. So our new little girl became Vogue's WOEBGON Mountain Dew. Yes, we wanted Heather's kennel name in her name and decided to use WOEBGON as our kennel name for the very first time. Mandy was indeed a wonderful girl. As you'll see in future episodes, getting Mandy from Heather was a great decision for us. It was wonderful having Mandy around the house, except for one problem. Introducing an intact female in an established home with intact males can cause problems. I'll talk more about that and a first aid trick for injured ears, something that happens with Basset Hounds, later in this episode. I started showing Mandy and she did well in the show ring. As I discussed earlier, she had a lot of attributes based on the AKC standard, and we thought judges would really like her. When Mandy was young, I showed her at the Greater San Diego Basset Hound Club specialty. The sweepstakes judge was a prominent breeder from Colorado. Mandy showed well for me. As the judge was going over Mandy, she said, "You're different. Where did you come from?" That was an unusual thing for a judge to say. Usually they don't say anything as they examine the dogs. I assumed that the statement meant that she liked Mandy because she was awarded Best of Opposite Sex in the sweepstakes. Heather showed Mandy's mother in veteran sweepstakes and she won Best in Veteran Sweepstakes. Heather and I decided to have a professional photographer at the show take a photo of both of us with the judge. When we were taking the photo, I told the judge, "This is where she came from," pointing to Mandy's mother. We all got a good laugh, but it also shows that the judge was fairly consistent in her judging. That summer, Pam and I planned on driving up to Oregon to see my parents and attend some Basset Hound specialties like we had done for several years. Heather and her parents had planned to go up to Oregon for the shows as well. The five of us had a great time together at the shows and going out for meals. Of course, we entered Mandy in the shows, and Heather had another Basset that she wanted to show. I don't remember all the particulars, except for some reason, Heather ended up showing Mandy, not me. I'm sure it had something to do with the fact that Heather was much better at showing Bassets than I was. So for some reason, Heather showed Mandy and won Winner's Bitch and Best of Winners with her. That was the first time one of our Bassets had ever been a winner at a Basset Hound specialty show. We all were extremely happy. Wins like this aren't easy to come by, and they're good for both the owner and the breeder. Mandy finished her AKC championship with Heather showing her at a show in Sacramento, California. The Saturday show was held the day after two Basset Hound specialty shows that we had attended on Friday. It was a great win because most of the other bitches that had entered the specialties were also entered in the show. Mandy defeated a lot of dogs that day. I showed Mandy after she finished her championship, and she picked up several Best of Opposite Sex wins, one of which was opposite to Heather's boy, Peanut, the dog that started this whole relationship. That was a very special win for all of us. Yes, we have a photo of that win too. Mandy continued to do well in veteran sweepstakes as she got older, as well as these two first-place placements at specialty shows in the veteran bitch class. Between her regular showing and becoming a veteran, we bred Mandy to Moose as we had planned. That, however, is a story for a different time. For those of you watching the video version, you may have noticed that Mandy did not have the usual white tip on her tail. Well, she had just a little teeny bit of white. Bassets have a little fluffy end on their tail. We usually trim that off when we show them because it looks better to have a little more of a rounded tip to the tail than a bunch of fluff sitting off the end. But in Mandy's case, that was the only white that she had, so I left it. But that's an issue that gets brought up as a myth of the standard, so it's one of my standard myths. I remember when we had the Basset Hound Club of America National Show in San Diego, and Pam and I went. One of my friends, is actually Judy Mack, came to me and she said, "I'm really frustrated. Our girl that we've entered in the Futurity sweepstakes doesn't have a white tip on her tail." And I said, "Well, is that a problem, Judy? The standard doesn't require it." And she looked at me and she said, "Are you sure?" And I said, yes, I'm sure that it's not required. So I asked Judy, where did you get the idea that the tip of the tail has to be white? And she said, well, it says so in Mercedes Braun's book, The Complete Basset Hound. So I have Mercedes Braun's book here, The Complete Basset Hound, and it does say the tail should be sufficient length to provide good balance with the length of the dog. It should be very thick at the base, tapering to a white tip to be seen in the field. Well, the white tip is not mentioned in our standard. So Mercedes Braun is actually interpreting the standard and saying that the dogs need a white tip. But that's not the case. So that's my standard myth of this episode. So what the standard does say is the tail is not to be docked and set in continuation of the spine with slight curvature and carried gaily in hound fashion. The hair under the underside of the tail is coarse. Our standard doesn't say that it should have a white tip. In fact, I don't know of any of standards of any of the hounds. I know Beagles doesn't have it, or at least I'm pretty sure. And I haven't found any other hounds where the white tip is required. Yes, I know it'd be great for it just easier to see out in the field with a white tip waving back and forth, but that's not part of our standard. Earlier in this episode, I mentioned that I'd say more about having two intact males and a female in the house at the same time and give you a good first aid tip. Sue Shoemaker had warned us many times about the problems that we might have if we have intact males and a female in the house at the same time. I called Sue one day to tell her we had decided to get Mandy, and boy, did I get an earful. Sue let me know that we'd made a big mistake. This is something that people out there should know, so I thought I'd mention it here. As I explained to Sue, we bought Moose from her to breed him. In order for someone to breed dogs, they have to get a girl to breed to. You can't get a litter out of a male Basset. That just doesn't work. Besides, the dog world recognizes the owner of the female as the breeder, not the owner of the male. Well, Sue was right. Buddy and Moose, though they loved being around each other and slept together every night, started to have these little episodes where they just didn't quite get along. They weren't bad. They were just like growling at each other or barking at each other. But one night, almost exactly at midnight, the two decided to have a big discussion next to our bed where they slept. Pam and I woke up, of course, with hearing all this noise, and they were over on Pam's side of the bed, so she was able to get them settled down. But then a few days later, or maybe it was a week later, not quite sure how long it was, we were celebrating Thanksgiving at our house, and we had all the family over, and there was a scent on the carpet that afternoon after everybody left that Moose and Buddy decided to fight over. It wasn't anything big, but when we broke up the fight between the two boys, Buddy managed to grab Moose's right ear. Of course, his teeth cut into the ear, and suddenly we had a bloody mess. I grabbed the ear to stop the bleeding and put some pressure on it. Pam went and got some gauze and one of our snoods that we have. Now, for those of you that don't know what a snood is, it's a piece of fabric that's made into a circle, and it has elastic at both ends. And we use them at dog shows to protect the ears for the dogs, to keep them from dragging on the ground and getting dirty, and keep the ears away from their mouths, the edges of their mouths, and that causes them to get dirty. So that's what we use a snood for. Now, I guess if you don't have a snood at your house, which a lot of you don't, a small t-shirt or even a piece of fabric would work. I then took a clip like one of these that we use for potato chip bags or different kinds of chip bags to close them after they've been opened. And I put the gauze on the wound. I put the snood around the ears. And then I put this clip at that spot so that it would hold the gauze to the ear and also keep Moose from being able to get the snood off of his head. And that worked quite well. When we got to the emergency vet's office, they were able to take all that off, and the bleeding had stopped, but he needed a couple of stitches in his ear. Now remember, this was, of course, Thanksgiving, so it took quite a while for the veterinary staff over at the emergency vet to get him into the office and get his ears sewn up. By clipping the gauze and the snood to his ears, I was able to get him at least into the crate, in the car, over to the vet's office, and they could take care of it from there. Now, some of you are then wondering, well, what did you do with the boys after that? We ended up doing what I've seen a lot of others do afterwards. Our dogs all lived in our house and our yard, and they were always together. They were able to come and go when we were home, and when we weren't home, they lived out in the yard or in a kennel building that we had built in the back of the yard. What we ended up doing is literally dividing our house. We set off the front room, which was where we had our living room and eventually put our dining room, and that was set up where Moose could stay. He could stay there, and once we put the dining room in, we had a door that went from the dining room outside that we added to the house. So he was able to go out. We had a doggy door put in the door so he could get in and out by himself out into that yard and onto a patio that was right outside. And in the rest of the house was where Buddy and the girls lived. Between the two, though, was a gate, one of those baby gates. We literally had to put a baby gate there that we had to step over all of the time to get into the house. So whenever we came into the house from the garage or the front door, we came into that dining room area where Moose was, and we had to step over the baby gate and get into the rest of the house. Now, having that baby gate was fine. The boys were fine. In fact, sometimes we'd find the two of them on each side of the baby gate, all snuggled up together. They liked each other, but for some reason, because of their hormones, they just couldn't get along if they sniffed a sniff that both of them really liked. And that's very common. Just so you know, the problem that we had with Moose and Buddy doesn't always happen. It just happened between the two of them. We've had other males in the house together that were intact with our intact females, and they got along just fine. So it's not something that's inevitable. It's something you need to be aware of. I mentioned earlier in the podcast that one of the things that Pam and I have done over the years is support Basset rescue. And this is a topic that I've sort of left out of some of my podcast episodes, and I thought for sure this one I'd put that in. I mentioned also that breeders and rescue can get along together. They can actually work together. I thought in this podcast I'd show you a little bit of how that works and where you can go for information from a reputable Basset Hound resource. One of the best places to go to look about Basset rescue organizations is the website of the Basset Hound Club of America. Under Find a Basset, click on Basset Rescue. That'll take you to a page that has a lot of information. It especially has some information here on Basset Hound Club of America recognized rescue groups. This link will take you to a page of all the different rescue groups that the Basset Hound Club of America recognizes. Here's the list of groups. I'd suggest you go here first if you want to rescue a Basset. Also on that Basset Rescue page, there's a section here called Consider Rescue, and then there's a mission statement of the Rescue Advisory Committee, why rescue, the process of adoption, how to find a reputable rescue group, and the BHCA recognized rescue groups that we already looked at. The page I'd suggest starting with is what is the adoption process? And on that page, they give you some simple steps that are part of the adoption process. Then below that is an important section called Adopter Beware. And this is a section you really need to understand. There are a lot of fake rescue organizations out there that will be glad to take your money and not give you a dog. Also on that page is an important email address that you might want to use. If you're at all unsure about a decision that you've made, there's a link to the chairman of the Basset Hound Rescue Committee's email address. Sandra Wittenberg will be happy to answer your questions and help you out. She's a wonderful lady. You can also contact me if you ever need help as well. I hope you found that information on Basset Rescue and the Basset Hound Club of America to be helpful. It is a really great resource for you to have for those of you that are in the United States. You need to understand that rescue is a big business today, and there's a lot of fraud out there and a lot of rescues that really don't rescue dogs. And so the Basset Hound Club of America has stepped in to try to help our breed and help the rescues that really do rescue dogs. I'm sure many of you didn't realize that the Basset Hound Club of America is involved somewhat with rescue, but it's the rescue organizations themselves that do all the work. The Basset Hound Club of America just tries their best to support them. I hope you enjoyed the story of how we got Mandy. We ended up working with Heather for several years until we lost her to swine flu at the age of 39. There's some information on our website that you can go to if you want to see Heather's story. It's a very tragic end to the life of a wonderful person. She was sort of like a daughter to us. Heather and the Shoemakers were great mentors to our breeding program and our work with Basset Hounds. I'd suggest that if you're interested in getting into Bassets and showing them or breeding or anything else, find a good mentor to work with. They can really help you out. They give you experience that you don't have, and they're also someone you could talk to when you need to. Remember the t-shirts, by the way. If you want a t-shirt like the one I have, you can buy it through our website, WOEBGONBassets.com. For now, we have them in Gildan and one that's from Bella Canvas. This is the one I'm wearing. Remember, the show notes, including photos, are available on our website, WOEBGONBassets.com. I also have other information there about Bassets and Basset Rescue. It's a great place to go for information about our breed. Even though Pam and I don't breed anymore, we decided to keep the website going to provide information that people like you need. Please remember, those of you watching on YouTube, to give it that thumbs up. That really is important for us. If you listen to the podcast through a place like Apple Podcasts, please remember to give it that high rating. We need those thumbs up and those high ratings to help push our podcast out to more people. The more people we get to listen to the podcast, the better off it's going to be. And we greatly appreciate your help. Recommending the podcast to others is another way you can help. If you know someone who loves Basset Hounds like we do, please recommend the podcast to them. Pam and I greatly appreciate your support, and thank you all very much for listening.
WOEBGON the Basset Hound podcast is published in visual form on YouTube the first Monday of every month. A full-length audio version of each episode is published 1 week later wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out our WOEBGON Basset's website for show notes including photos from every episode. You can also find links to the podcast plus information on Don and his wife Pam plus their Basset Hounds. WOEBGON the Basset Hound podcast is produced, researched and hosted by Don Bullock. The music is Do Your Ears Hang Low played by Nasrality from the Philippines. It's available royalty-free on Pixabay. Please give this podcast a thumbs up on YouTube and a high rating wherever you listen to podcasts.
Until next time, this is Don. Thank you very much for listening.